Welcome, everyone. It's great to be with you. Let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Ed Martin, and I'm the president of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, Phyllis Schlafly's organizations. We have 3 or 4 or 5 organizations affiliated, from which we also, like this meeting today and like what we're doing today, is try to communicate the best of policies, especially as it applies to politics. So on behalf of the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, welcome. This is a great opportunity to be together. I think, and Chandra will correct me when I get it wrong, there's been a number of these. I can tick through them. I made a list of these gatherings. We're just down the block from Capitol Hill. So, we're here because I think we all want them to know we're here. We also want them to come here if they can be a part of this. And some of these meetings that we've had, there have been members of Congress come in and out. And so don't be surprised. That's the reason we're so close to, the reason we're in the swamp, not of the swamp, as I like to say. But we had critical topics. We talked about religious freedom, human rights, military readiness, the environment, the economy, and political process. Here's what the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy says about their mission. So you know why you're here and what you're hearing, and hopefully why you'll come back to the next gathering that we have. They're in their own words. The Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy believes that the United States must pursue a realistic and restrained foreign policy. Foundational to responsible and thoughtful foreign policy is the need for congressional consent for all acts of war. Too often, Congress has taken a back seat in directing military actions, acquiescing to the president. These are the words of this committee, these organizations. You can hear the point. The Constitution spells out in Article 1 that the authority to authorize war comes exclusively from Congress. I think I joked with George. We were talking about how to make Article 1 great again. How we teach everybody from the students to the members of Congress to the executive branch that Article 1, I will say, I was talking to John Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly's oldest son, this morning about this meeting, and we were talking about how he was saying, John's a great historian like his mother, and he said the founders wanted, the Congress, Article 1 was first for a reason. It was supposed to be the most powerful in many of the ways, and today it's secondary in some of the most significant ways. So thank you for coming, and that's the mission statement of the committee. Today's conversation is the intellectual forces driving the perpetual wars. So pulling back a little, and I'll introduce Paul in a minute, but pulling back a little from what's happening in the political process, what's happening right there, what are the intellectual forces driving this? Have the forces run out of steam? Have they just retrenched? What is the reality of this? And the question at the center of this is that there seems to be an elite group of individuals who have sort of popularized phrases. We know them: regime change and nation building and empire. And though the popularization of those has kind of crowded out terms that had a longer history, like national interest and common good. And so, I don't know if when Shonda and I were preparing for this, my late boss, Phyllis Schlafly, her number one American, the one she looked to and said taught us so much, was George Washington. What he wrote, what he spoke, how he lived. And Washington had warned us that he described that there would be, quote, there would be corrupted and deluded citizens who would betray the interests of their own country for the sake of popularity or infatuation with other nations. And this sort of elite group of intellectuals in the last 20 years has sort of popularized these notions. So we turn, of course, from the great George Washington to one of our most iconic leaders of today, Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson has recently written in Ship of Fools. And we chuckle, Tucker Carlson, first of all, he's a great writer. He really is a fine writer. But Tucker Carlson is who, when I talk to our grassroots leaders out in America, Phyllis Schlafly's Eagles, our leaders are in every state at various levels. They follow, and Tucker Carlson has touched a nerve with how he's communicating and what he's saying. And this is what he says in his recent book, Ship of Fools. He chalks all of this up to a, quote, late-stage ruling class with a high tolerance for mediocrity. So he calls this a late-stage ruling class with a high tolerance for mediocrity. He goes further. In a culture like this, there's no penalty for being wrong. Repeatedly on wars, for example. The talentless prosper, rising inexorably towards positions of great power and breaking things along the way. It happened to the Ottomans, and Max Boot is living proof that it's happening in America. This is Tucker Carlson. Now the question is, he says late stage ruling class. Is it a late stage ruling class? Again, is it in retreat? Is it, waiting us out? Is it, what is it about what's happening, and how do we see that? And that's what we hear today. Do we think they're going to fade away? Do we think 2 terms of Trump will transform it? There's a lot of questions, and there's not as many answers. And so our speaker today on this topic is Dr. Paul Gottfried. And besides being the Raffensperger Professor of Humanities at Elizabethtown College, he told me, which is his best credential for me, is he was at Phyllis Schlafly, some of our Eagle Council events and other places, speaking on these many issues. He's taught at Elizabethtown for 25 years. He's a Guggenheim recipient, Yale PhD, is author of 13 books. The most recent is called Fascism, Career of a Concept and Revisions and Dissents. And again, our topic today is the intellectual forces driving the perpetual wars. Couldn't have a better speaker on this topic, and I welcome Dr. Paul Gottfried. Paul?
Sometimes when I'm introduced, I have no idea whom they're introducing. It doesn't sound like me. The fact that I've written 13 books, I suppose simply comes from being around a long time and reading a lot of books, reading a lot of other books, and being retired and feeling sort of a natural inclination to write. As I've indicated, I'm a perfect speaker if we're trying to bridge the distance between the Marxist left and the old right or something like that. Since I'm a member of the old right who for many years wrote for Marxist publications, even while being a member of the old right. So I feel that I'm the perfect bridge at this point in my life. What I'm going to give you is an historical overview of how we got to where we are, since I am by training an historian. I really cannot replicate or equal the performance given last night by Cy Hirsch in providing you with the latest details about what the Secret Service in the United States is up to. But I can give you an historical overview going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century and then reaching the present and dealing with long-range trends, long-range political and cultural trends, which may explain why we do have perpetual war for perpetual peace, to quote any number of people who said that phrase before I did. An enthusiasm for military adventures is by no means limited to either pole of our political spectrum. At least since the First World War and America's entry onto the international scene as a world power, our foreign relations have been characterized by a missionary spirit that intermittently turns belligerent. And the spirit is hardly limited or has been hardly restricted to a single national party. Perhaps I should indicate before proceeding further what seems to me an at least minimally justifiable reason for applying force. Those who are defending their homeland or region from invasion are taking up arms for good reason. This would pertain to a wide range of situations, whether we're describing the Spanish guerrillas who resisted Napoleon's occupation of Spain, local residents who tried to keep Sherman's army from overrunning and sacking Georgia and South Carolina, or the Red Army when it was struggling to throw Hitler's forces out of Russia. In none of these cases were the defenders choosing to make war on others. They were fighting defensively and were certainly not seeking to brutalize or kick around unwilling subjects. I am also not targeting here the attitudes of a traditional military class. Military elites have been inculcated with martial values and a sense of service. This kind of training may or may not deserve our praise, depending on how it is applied, but military classes are not the subject of my remarks today. What I am looking at is the Messianic depiction of the U.S. as the bearer of a world mission that we are obliged to pursue in the face of opposition, both domestic and foreign. When I was in college studying American history, mainstream historians at the time presented the Civil War, World War I, and World War II as providential occasions for spreading our democratic principles. The U.S. entered wars and fought them to their bloody end, or so I was told, in order to advance universal ideals, like making the world safe for democracy or undertaking a war to end all wars. There's also a widespread notion among our foreign policy elites that our statecraft is amoral or immoral unless it is firmly tied to the goal of making others live like us. That is, espousing those values that our foreign policy elites and our national media would like others to have. Democracy is also defined by whatever stage of political development the U.S. has reached at a particular time. According to Hillary Clinton in the New Republic, for example, we can only pursue foreign policy morally if we fight for current feminist goals. For Republicans, it is also necessary to bring others the benefit of global capitalism while luring or pushing them into alliance with our government. According to neoconservative policy expert James Kirchick, fighting for democracy against the fascist tyrant Vladimir Putin also requires that we bestow on Russians all the advances in gay rights that we've enacted in the U.S. In foreign policy, Kirchick insists that we push back hard against Putin, who calls for, quote, the protection of traditional values from the forces of post-nationalism. Kirchick, unquote. Kirchick scolds Trump supporters for collaborating with the reactionary Russian government against which we've hesitated to take a sufficiently hard line. This unfriendly stance toward Russia and our proliferating designated enemies throughout the world is not characteristic of the left exclusively. Indeed, some of the most outspoken critics of this position, like Stephen Cohn and Glenn Greenwald, have themselves come from the left. All the same, the historic left, and even more the present American conservative establishment, take an aggressive approach to international relations because of a shared passion to impose everywhere their preferred values. A quintessential statement of this tendency is in Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, a book that only in contemporary America would be proclaimed a conservative classic. According to Bloom, quote, and when we Americans speak seriously about politics, we mean that our principles of freedom and equality and the rights of men are rational and everywhere applicable. World War II was really an educational experiment undertaken to force those who do not accept our principles to do so. One might infer from this that over 400,000 German and other civilians who were eradicated in terror bombing in 1944 and 1945 were just students in an educational experiment intended to enhance their appreciation of human rights. This form of pedagogy would seem strange to anyone who didn't share Bloom's global democratic obsessions. It is a taste or style that prevails among the millions of improperly named American conservatives who gobbled up his teachings and who provided him with astounding book sales. And this human rights belligerence irritates even those of us who think the American government was right in working to remove the Nazi government in Germany, something, by the way, that we could have been done without demanding unconditional surrender, devastating Central Europe, and handing over Eastern Europe to Stalinist tyranny. If the U.S., moreover, had played a genuine peacemaker role in World War I without joining the Allies to crush the Central Powers and subsequently inflict a vindictive peace, it would not have been necessary to intervene against the expansionist Third Reich. Indeed, by the summer of 1917, according to Emeritus Professor of Contemporary History at the Sorbonne, Jean-André Soutou, the French and Germans were negotiating a peace which the French could reject once American troops arrived. Please note that even before the U.S. entered a war that would exact over 100,000 American lives and many times that number in casualties, this country was by far the world's major industrial power. No matter which side in Europe dragged itself to the finish line first after losing millions of lives, American industrial and economic preeminence would have remained secure. The U.S. needed trading partners on both sides of the conflict and had no national interest, if I may use that amoral term, in seeing one side destroy the other. I raise these points because it astonishes me that our neoconservative publicists defend American involvement in World War I as something we had to do in order to check the German autocratic threat to our democratic way of life. This particular position resonates well with, among others, a certain type of British Tory, perhaps best exemplified by the late Margaret Thatcher, who never forgave the Kaiser for the Great War. Thatcher seems to have forgotten that the British Foreign Minister Edward Grey and a number of his cabinet members, including Churchill, plus the British ambassadors to France and Russia, all played key roles in the alliance system leading to the blow-up. Every major belligerent, as Harry Elmer Barnes correctly pointed out in the 1920s, and Christopher Clark more recently, contributed significantly to the disaster of 1914. The U.S. might have contributed constructively to a peace, but unfortunately we never tried to negotiate honestly. Our government was pro-British from the outset for cultural reasons, and because British propagandists were much better at their work than their glaringly inept German and Austrian counterparts. But a curious feature of the pro-British interventionists was the cooperation of two groups of partisans that were equally determined to push us into war. First were the self-identified progressives, and I don't mean to offend progressives who are sitting in this room, but these are progressives in 1914, like Herbert Croly, Walter Lippmann, and John Dewey, many writing for the very early New Republic. This crowd saw American intervention as a path for creating a social democratic public administration while fighting internationally for democracy. Libertarian economist Murray Rothbard has written a book and a number of articles on the pivotal role played by these reformers. Eventually, they teamed up with liberal Protestant theologians who identified America's struggle on the side of England as a providential plan. Our entry into the European conflict was supposedly integral to creating God's kingdom on earth. Second among the interventionists were members of our patrician class like Henry Cabot Lodge, Elihu Root, Nicholas Murray Butler, A. Lawrence Lowell, and many Anglophile Southern historians whom I discuss in an article for Historically Speaking, which is on the desk next to Fran. This group happily recycled the language of progressive interventionists for their own purpose. They too presented the struggle as one between democracy and autocracy, and one that would help spread our enlightened views. War advocates like Lodge and Lowell, who were passionately pro-British and proud of their British ancestry, understood the PR value of appealing to universal ideals. They perceived no contradiction between proclaiming a crusade for democracy and their vigorous support for immigration restriction at home. After all, both their wartime interventionism and their efforts to restrict immigration were aimed at preserving things British. Patrician interventionists bestowed on us another legacy that outlasted the early 20th century. They founded the Council for Foreign Relations in 1921, which has helped maintain liberal internationalism as the cornerstone of American foreign policy. Among high-placed foreign policy advisors, Being for Democracy has served as the basis for distinguishing friends from enemies. Last week, I learned from our media that the other democracies supported our efforts to get rid of Nicolas Maduro as president of Venezuela and to replace him with Juan Guaido. Allegedly authoritarian states, which included Bolivia and Mexico, as well as Russia and China, sided with Maduro because they're against democracy and human rights. Although there's no reason to defend Maduro's gross, horrible mismanagement of his country, we should note that there are competing interests here. Those who back Maduro have motives other than their membership in the Kingdom of Darkness. The Russians and Chinese loaned Maduro tens of billions of dollars and expect to be getting something in return. Other countries are upset by the obtrusive role played by los Norteamericanos in isolating the Venezuelan president. The plan that John Bolton has devised for sending 5,000 soldiers into harm's way to overthrow the Venezuelan regime would get sticky, particularly if the Venezuelan military remains loyal to their present leader. Perhaps before ending, I should make a few observations about the ideological backing and political effects of our war in Vietnam. Advocates of this involvement consisted mainly of liberal internationalist Democrats and liberal internationalist Republicans. Lyndon Johnson and his advisors seized on the boilerplate phraseology in order to justify their intervention. They even promised to bring Great Society programs to the Mekong Delta once American and South Vietnamese forces had triumphed. Among critics of our intervention were George Kennan, at least initially Senator Richard Russell, and several other Southern senators, some outspoken libertarians, the John Birch Society, and what was left of the interwar right. The pro-communist left, represented by presidential candidate George McGovern, opposed the military action for obvious ideological reasons, which I discussed with George O'Neill yesterday. Unlike World War II, in which McGovern served as a bomber, we were fighting communists in Vietnam, which is the reason that many academics of my acquaintance opposed our engagement there. An unmistakable sympathy for the communist enemy, which I recall encountering among some articulate critics of the war, weakened my receptiveness to their arguments. This partisanship stood in striking contrast to an observation made to me by the late Christopher Lasch long after the events in question. Lasch offered a cogent argument against our entanglement in Vietnam, which applies to other more recent temptations to rush to intervention. Given the brutal behavior of the Viet Cong, it is certainly possible to depict the struggle against them as a just war. But not every just war or just cause justifies an American military presence and the probable loss of numerous American lives. My impression was that most of the young protesters were neither pro-communist nor anti-communist. They were just trying to avoid being fed into the meat grinder in Southeast Asia, and so they demonstrated against the war and burned draft cards. As for the anti-war hippies smoking weed and holding love beads, I'm not sure one could discern much of any political doctrine in their bizarre behavior. They were just hanging out, or tuning out. At least part of the left, namely that part that included Norman Podhoretz and Ronald Radish, engaged in personally profitable soul-searching. Podhoretz famously produced a long book teeming with second thoughts in 1982, Why We Were in Vietnam. These neoconservative second thoughts affected the American right in ways that I've described in my books. As is widely known, the post-World War II conservative movement came about in large part to prosecute the struggle against communism. Conservative Catholic leaders like Pius XII and Cardinal Spellman of New York encouraged the struggle, while arch-conservative writers often got their start as strong anti-communist polemicists. Indeed, anti-communism was the lifeblood of the post-World War II right in the U.S., and this continued to be the case throughout most of the Cold War. Not surprisingly, those who founded National Review were both ardent defenders of Senator Joe McCarthy and advocates of liberating Eastern Europe. In retrospect, it might be observed this movement was driven more by what it opposed with relentless fury than by any vision of political and moral order. The enemy was what determined the cause. It may also be useful to note other aspects of this anti-communist crusade that are now swept under the rug. The conservative movement in the 1950s came to define itself partly by battling those on the right who were less aggressively anti-communist. The new conservatism fought furiously against isolationists who despised the communists but who fear the effects of continued military mobilization. Taft Republicans, anti-big government libertarians, and even some McCarthyites who denounced communism but who opposed sending troops overseas went down to defeat. All such critics of liberal internationalism disappeared from most conventional accounts of the American right since the 1950s. And it is in the work of non-establishment authors, including Marxist scholars like William Appleman Williams, that such figures have survived as a respectful presence. It is also clearly no accident that those anti-communists who came to dominate the conservative movement by the 1980s were not even recognizably conservative by the standards of the 1950s. By then, neoconservatives had become the shakers and movers, and many of their complaints against the Soviets were grounded in ethnic concerns about the Soviet regime and its relation to Zionist dissidents, and in their support of social democratic labor movements. The neoconservative opposition to the Russian government did not end with the Cold War. It has continued in the form of incessant protest against Russian nationalist leadership. Meanwhile, neoconservatives Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, and Max Boot have carried their gripes into the Democratic Party and onto CNN. We may also question whether the Soviet Empire's disintegration has been a victory for the right outside of Eastern Europe. A reunited Germany has moved far to the left, culturally and socially, since 1991, and the same development has occurred in less dramatic fashion in other Western countries. Outside of economic issues, the communist bloc was arguably more conservative by the end of the Cold War than the side that prevailed. It is highly unlikely that any communist society would approve of gay marriage, fluid gender identities, and the acceptance of Sharia law in countries that have already pushed their Christian traditions into the corner. In any case, it may be hard to prove that the Cold War ended for the West in a situation that conservatives of the 1950s would have cheered. Prolonged wars or tensions often end in ways that their earlier contestants could not have imagined. In the case of the Cold War, it would be simplistic to imagine that it was ever an exclusively right-wing thing. Much of the anti-fascist rhetoric of the Second World War got pumped into the anti-Soviet struggle under the Truman administration. What's more, a large anti-Soviet leftist front already existed by the time that clashes broke out over a divided Germany. The neoconservatives were perfectly correct when they called attention to their pedigree as liberal anti-communist. They never hid the fact that they stood in a progressive anti-Soviet tradition, which eventually became integrated into the present conservative movement. Someone reading National Review circa 1960 or attending Yale graduate school like me in the mid-1960s would not have been aware that there was a vigorous anti-communist left as well as an anti-communist center and anti-communist right. Certainly my professors and classmates did not reveal this critical fact, which only became obvious years later. Back then, I never heard of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an international organization for the anti-communist left paid for by the CIA. I also never came across, until much later, the Congress's journal Encounter, which opposed the Soviets from a recognizably left-of-center political position. Back in the 1960s, anti-communism for me was synonymous with the Buckleyite right, and I was far from alone in this illusion. In the end, anti-communist forces that were not part of the right turned out to be more important for the outcome of the Cold War than those who wrote for National Review in the 1960s. Lest anyone doubt this, please recall which side won the presidential race in 1964. Was it the embattled anti-communist of the right, Barry Goldwater, or the Cold War liberal, Lyndon Johnson? In the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, certain elements of what had belonged to the left center took charge of our anti-Soviet politics. The National Endowment for Democracy, which Congress created in November 1983 and which still enjoys federal support, is tasked with promoting democracy abroad. Figures who were associated with it, the endowment, like the Undersecretary of State in the 80s, Elliott Abrams, its director Carl Gershman, shaped the way American foreign policy was presented to the public under the Reagan administration. George W. Bush happily latched on to this proselytizing language during the Iraq War 20 years later. And I still catch the old customary phrases when President Trump tells us that he is standing up for values internationally. Again, I'm not trying to indict the left or the right exclusively for the failure and excesses of liberal internationalism. The same view of the world seems to come back, no matter which governments we elect, a liberal internationalist template, which I once described in a long essay for Orbis as the invincible Wilsonian matrix. In a very real sense, the global democratic crusaders who led us into World War I never departed this world. President Wilson continues to preside, at least in spirit, over the making of American foreign policy. As I began by stating, this matrix is not limited to any one side of our conventional political spectrum. It is present throughout. Thank you.
And let me ask you the first one. We talked about, Tucker Carlson maybe
Right.
being optimistic, saying
Right.
that it's a late stage, we're at a late stage in this movement.
Right.
Do you think it's a late stage? Do you think you recognize that it's at an ending point, or is it at a lower point? And what's your sense of it?
I think he's wildly optimistic. No, my sense of the matter is that the Democrats or the people in the left center who are mistakenly viewed as the peace party become the war party, as soon as it is politically expedient. Right. And they've done that. And if Hillary Clinton had won the presidential race, she would have at least in 10 wars to spread lesbian rights or something like that. And you could see how all the neocons just, gravitated toward her. And now that, Trump has won, some of them are moving back. I have to say, I have to give Max Boot, Bill Kristol, and Robert Kagan credit. They have too much dignity, to crawl back to the Republicans now that they've committed themselves to the Democrats. Yeah. They just stay where they are. But I really do not I do not think that this is the end of liberal internationalism in idealistic foreign policy being used to promote war. I think it is going to continue.
Yep.
It seems like over the last several years, we're starting to see a shift where the GOP used to be representing the elites and so on, and now we're seeing the Democrats. So it seems like it's kind of making the shift back to where it was at the turn of the century, where Republicans fought for the slaves. And so it seems to me that there's a bit of a shift. Are you seeing that shift and the parties kind of going back to where they were from the beginning?
No. No, I'm afraid I don't. Except in one sense, that the Democratic Party has always been the party of minorities, collections of minorities. At one time, it was a collection of ethnic and religious minorities, and it also contained the South, which lost the Civil War. So, and people were sort of outside, one might say, of the general political electoral mainstream, became Democrats, and occasionally they won, by pulling in enough people. And the mainstream was pretty much, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, with maybe a small Catholic elite or Jewish elite or something like that. But it was heavily, and not only that, it was also heavily Methodist, right? I mean, they wanted suffrage for women, so that they would. One of the arguments is they would vote to ban alcohol, which was, a cardinal position of the Methodist Church. And once the Methodist Church was sort of like the backbone of the Republican Party outside the South. I mean, the South, they were Democrat. I think in the case of the Republicans, there is a consistency. The Republican Party was historically the party of empire, of war, of empire. The period in which we may like it, which was, the period in which people like Robert Taft were in the ascendant, is the exception. That before the First World War, the Republicans, or during the war, they were much worse warmongers than the Democrats. Even if after the war was over, they back away, and some of them, like Lodge, wisely opposes the American membership in the League of Nations.
But with President Trump, and we see his election landslide. It seems like he went and campaigned on getting out of these wars and out of being interventionist, and he won a landslide election. So people obviously out there agreed with that, so they're shifting a little bit away from the war hawks.
I wish I could believe this. It was not really a landslide. And, I did vote for Trump, and I did support that position, but he seems to be backing away from it right now. And many of these neoconservative advisors are surrounding him. And that's understandable, because you have to go to the foreign policy establishment for your advisors. He's not going to come to us. He's going to go to the establishment, and he's going to go to Heritage or AI, and they'll tell him how to run his foreign policy. So unless you can change the power alignment, it's going to be very hard, to change the nature of politics with regard to foreign policy. I mean, you have to replace the establishment. And that's a very hard thing to do. And Trump, as an outsider, I don't think really succeeded because he did not come with a vision such as the one that you represent. He just said, maybe we're involved in too many wars. And, there are people like us who resonate to that, but I'm not sure that, this would ensure, majority support for radically changing the nature of American foreign policy.
Can you address China a bit in the perspective as libertarians? We used to think that bringing about prosperity in the world would also bring peace, or at least people less inclined to start wars. And with China, of course, we helped create that prosperity. Mm-hmm. And yet now we're worried. But what do you think American policy should be with China?
I think the course that Trump is pursuing may be the correct one, which is sort of, forcing them to sort of play by the rules. One thing about Tucker Carlson's foreign policy I do not like is he seems to be trying to incite us to war against China. And I think he's sort of doing this in order to shift the conversation away from the Russian menace. He's perfectly right about Russia, but I don't think it's a good idea to sort of shift militaristic focus to China. I mean, there's no reason, to try to push the Chinese militarily. Although I think the current government is right in placing pressure on them to play by the same rules that we do.
Yes, sir. Over here. As a member of the old right who wrote for Marxist periodicals, I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on that classic New Left position that much of expansionist U.S. foreign policy is the result of domestic commercial interests played out on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, although I have emphasized the ideological basis for this, I do not mean to suggest that there are not economic interests that are being represented. I mean, obviously, defense industries are up to their ears, in supporting AEI, Heritage Foundation, other so-called conservative Republican foundations, and they, it's sort of hard to separate the two. The classical Marxist view, which I think is sort of hard to sustain, the one that you find in Hilferding and Luxemburg and other people writing around the time of the First World War, that countries go to war exclusively, or almost exclusively, in response to economic competition and the quest for new markets. I think that's outdated. What I think you see is rather a combination of certain, but I don't think one can rule out, the sort of American missionary spirit to bring democracy to the rest of the world. The defense industries and the other economic interests fall into line. But those are repeatedly given as the justifications for military intervention. I mean, as soon as the government decides to intervene or this, what it does is sort of incite the public, by saying that we're fighting for human rights or democracy. And anybody who opposes this position obviously is a bad person. You're not on the side of democracy. Now, and there are certain economic inevitably come into line, but this is one debate I've had with people about World War I. Does the United States intervene in World War I because J.P. Morgan has made enormous loans to England, which were actually crushing loans? My friend Justice Dunnicky wrote a book on World War I showing the magnitude of these loans that were coming. But my response to this is that J.P. Morgan made those loans because he was pro-British. And he was trying to push the American government into war on the side of it. And people of his class were pro-British, just as the German farmer in the Midwest was not. So one has to understand the cultural, nationalistic basis for making those loans. There were other people who made loans to the other side, German Jewish bankers who hated the Russians, and supported the old country. So they made loans to the other side. They lost their loans, of course. But I think one cannot exclude in looking at World War I, which are very, very strong Anglophile sentiments among elites, among coastal elites particularly. And although certain economic interests will be served by the war, and certain loans will be paid back, nonetheless, I think the cultural and national sentiments are very important in understanding why America got into that war. Yes?
Yes, sir.
So when I make an observation, you may want to make a distinction between negative peace and positive peace, the absence of war, or positive peace like the European Union model with integration and moving towards removing borders and so forth. And the question I have is, who would be the leading intellectuals of peace in the United States, and why have they failed in developing a competing paradigm?
Well, I think one problem is that many of the people who say, we're in favor of world peace, I mean, this is very, very nice, but this is not exactly a paradigm. I think the more sensible position is to say, force is not entirely ruled out. There are situations in which you may have to intervene, in some way against a danger. I think Hitler and Stalin were both dangerous. I don't think the Germans in World War I were at all. But I mean, there are situations in which you do have to intervene. But it should always be done in what should we say, the least destructive fashion, and making the least efforts to bring about a cataclysm. And I think if you look at some of the American interventions, such as World War II, I mean, they were just enormous. The American Civil War, look at the number of deaths that you get from there. So in order to justify this carnage, you have to come up with some argument that we fought for high principles. But of course, the high principles do motivate people because they're taught to believe that these are justifiable goals to go to war. But most groups that have sort of worked for world peace do not really offer an alternative paradigm. They just say, the world would be better off without war. The college at which I teach comes out of a German and a Baptist peace tradition. It no longer is Christian in any recognizable sense, but it pushes pacifism, which was one of their original tenets a few hundred years ago or something, but they still push this. But then they have something called peace studies. I have never been invited to speak because I'm not considered sufficiently in favor of peace because, I'm not a nice guy or I'm associated with the right or something like this. Well, you go to these things, they're usually ridiculous. It's like, why do they make war? They're all terrible people, and we're very virtuous because we're against war, and this is our tradition. And even when I agree with them, I've sometimes gone to these things, there's very little substance in what they say. So they're not offering us a paradigm, they're simply deploring, they're sort of virtue signaling and deploring people who make war. Well, which you, and then...
We'll go there next, but go back.
Okay.
Same table in the back.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to, in the context of peace, wanted to know the trend of Congress not voting for war, essentially after World War II. We have, several unauthorized wars, and as far as, right now, obviously, as we speak, they're debating about the war powers resolution on Yemen, and it seems like there's a trend right now in Congress to reassert its Constitutional War Authority. I want you to speak on that, and do you see that continuing, and is there room for that to grow?
Yeah, I would hope that would be the case. The problem, it seems to me that it's always used in a partisan fashion, that you get one party going after a president of the other party. And this kind of thing only works if you can get bipartisan support. Not only bipartisan support, it has to be across the political spectrum. To get Susan Collins and Kamala Harris to vote for something, it's not going to be very convincing because you get a very liberal Democrat and a very, very liberal Republican who often vote down. You have to show strong bipartisan, and there has been for some legislation in the past, and that kind of thing could work. It could have teeth. Of course, they immediately would be attacked by much of the media, and the whole foreign policy establishment would come after them.
The last vote, SJ Res 54, we had Todd Young, a lot of right wingers. I think there was 8 Republicans that voted on that measure that passed. So I was just wondering if you thought that was kind of the start of something bigger.
Yeah, I think the problem with Republicans is they're the party of war right now. Together with you have two parties of war, but the Republicans are always going to be predictably the party of war. I mean, Walter Jones, who died a few days ago, was a man on the right who was against all these wars. You're not going to get there are very few people like that left in the Republican Party, and the people who advise them are Heritage and AI. I think it might be harder unless you can develop a new sort of isolationist Republican opposition, what's called isolationist. Of course, the word I don't like to use the word isolationist because I'm not an isolationist. I just think we should stay out of most of these stupid wars we get into. But I think you know what I mean. People who want constitutional powers to be asserted, want Congress to declare war, and are against these illegal military actions. You have to get bipartisan support, and I think it's going to be a lot harder now than it was, let's say, in the 1980s or the 1970s. I think it's becoming increasingly hard. I think from Reagan's administration on, it is, because Reagan is, the guy who fights the communists. He's the Cold War president and so forth. And more of these Republicans just fall into line afterwards.
Over here.
Yeah.
So Paul, I agree your introduction wasn't complete, and that You didn't talk about, which you probably didn't know, of Paul's leadership in getting Paleocon group, albeit not huge, but been going on almost 20 years now, the H.L. Mencken Club. So why don't you tell the group about that and what our meeting's going to be, our theme this November 8th and 9th at our meeting up in Baltimore.
I wasn't supposed to give this propaganda for my organization, but no, we've only been around for 11 years, and we generally, I suppose, we're like a throwback to the interwar right, and favor sort of very limited government, basically keeping our nose clean in terms of wars, and I think our theme this year is going to be something, is the United States a nation? Is it still a nation? Was it ever a nation? And we're going to have some people's, some of the papers that were very critical, by the way, of American nationalism, arguing that it's, it is not really a force of the right. It has become pretty much the plaything of neoconservatives. And some people making regionalist arguments. Fran is on our board. I think she's been on our board from the very beginning. I don't think there's anybody else. John Utley occasionally comes to our meetings. So we meet in early November.
November 8th and 9th is our
Right. 8th, you know all about this. You and my wife know all about it. And you're all invited to come.
HLMenkenClub.com.
Right. So it meets every year. We typically get between 70 and 90 people. I think we were attacked several times. I think by the Southern Poverty Law Center criticized us.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Great sign of progress.
Because Richard Spencer had been a member of our group briefly and then left, but continued to attack me because his presence was there. So. But the group I think is it's pretty much I don't know, we have pretty much the same people. We have pretty much of a geriatric crowd, and I'd be delighted if we could pick up a lot of younger members, not nutty younger members, but sane ones.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on a couple of things. We used to have in this country a war tax from time to time. We also had a draft. Mm-hmm. We scuttled those two,
Right.
which insulates the population. Mm-hmm. From much of what you're discussing.
Right.
We also have embarked upon debt-financed consumption, and over the last 17 or 18 years, I would argue that you've had debt-financed war on a scale that dwarfs everything in the past. Putting all of those things together, don't you think the $22 trillion national sovereign debt will operate as a brake on further expansion beyond our borders, along with a lot of other things?
I would hope so, but I don't know. You're right about the draft. If every time but now of course you can fight these sort of hygienic wars with a very limited force, a professional army, and you occasionally hire this out. You get people you pay mercenaries to fight these wars. So as long as the public is not personally involved, and as long as your life is not on the line, you don't pay a high cost for these military involvements, even if, a million people in Iraq get bombed. It's just something you look at on the evening news while you're eating supper. But I really don't see this changing dramatically. And as far as the monetization of war, that, the debt just goes up. The debt goes up, Now, the one war I thought, recent war, that was very costly was the Iraq War, which really set us back in terms of debt. But then, when Obama came in, he simply increased spending, and it continues to go up under Trump. So I don't know whether the increase in debt to $25 or $30 trillion, this is going to act as a brake on wars. I think you're right about the draft. The draft is important. The fact that people are being insulated from the effects of making war. And wars are just treated as these sort of, surgical precision operations where you go in, you bomb a country, and then.
But it's not war.
Yeah, right.
It's really not war.
Yeah. Well, that's the way people view it. This is not really war.
Well, yeah. Well, I think the $22 trillion debt does matter. very seriously. I think if you go to 4 to 5% in the interest rates, suddenly your payment on the debt is taking up
Are
most
you
of your
saying it
budget.
does matter or should matter?
No, I'm saying it does matter. And I think it's the elephant in the room, and I think people know it. Remember, Congress makes its case by redistributing income and spending money. That's their bread and butter.
Right.
They don't know how to do anything else, so they're not going to act to do anything about it. My suspicion is no one will. And then, of course, we have Saudi Arabia, China, and Japan, who are principal holders of that sovereign national debt.
Right.
I think all of these things are coming home to roost in some fashion. I just don't see how you can continue to sustain the expansion and the overseas operations. By the way, if you look at the numbers of forces we had 10 years ago overseas and today, they've dramatically reduced.
Yeah.
So I think the trend lines are away from all the things that you're talking about, regardless of what people in Washington want. My question is, what do you think the impact of that debt will be in the future? Because I don't see how we bypass it. I mean, this business of, well, we'll just raise the debt level again, and then we artificially suppress the interest rates. I think those things are coming to an end.
No, I agree. No, I think the United States will have less financial capacity to make war in the future. I think there's, this may save us in the end, rather than changing public opinion or people rejecting liberal internationalism.
It's the only thing that will constrain us.
Yes.
Is the money.
Right.
I just want to follow up on that too. What about the reissuance of tax money? And we used to appropriate, you had to pay tax for war. Would that not get everybody in the country involved in the process? If they're paying tax, regardless of their tax bracket, everybody has to pay?
Slowly.
Yeah.
Slowly it will, but I think there will be a debt crisis. Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? Let me do one quick follow-up and ask you. We talked about how the language has been taken, regime change, and it's replaced national interest.
Right.
What about the phrases that Trump has made popular with people, like America First? America First got mischaracterized about Lindbergh,
Right.
and made into anti-Semitic as
Right,
opposed to
right.
being. But I mean, the power of the movement right now includes, it seems to me, some of these. A lot of people, younger people, are saying America First feels right. Now they don't know what that means yet.
Right.
And
Right.
so that's the question: can we claim some of these new words with a broader meaning in the right direction?
Well, we can try to claim them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the problem is that
others
others may use them in a different way. Bill Kristol
Yeah,
may say
exactly.
America First.
That's right, exactly. That's
in his
the
own
problem.
way.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Paul Gottfried. Thank you for being here. We very much appreciate it.